And I'm really delighted to have David Hope and Avril Dewar with us, and they're from the Centre of Medical Education, and they're going to talk about some of the work that I'm going to say we, because we in the vet school have also been involved with. So I'll hand over to David.
So to give you a bit of background on our project, a couple of years ago we started to track how well our students do across a 5-year medical program. Essentially, basic stuff. They arrive, 3 months later, they take an exam. 5 years later, they're about to leave. How well does our early work predict how well they eventually do? And we found that the association was strong, extremely strong, much stronger than we had expected. And this kind of threw up the issue of whether we can support students just after they arrive by identifying risk factors. So, in concert with the School of Vets and Medicine, we've been developing an early warning system, basically looking at measures of engagement, early warning signs of student difficulty. That's not what I'm going to talk about today, but that's the background to the project still in progress and going well. What I'm particularly interested in talking about today is the role that information can play in creating ethical and practical dilemmas for teachers in educational context, and particularly the way you can actually learn things very rapidly that might exceed your expectations in ways that create challenges. So none of the measures in particular are anything that at first sight would seem dramatic or invasive or ethically or cognitively challenging. Things like, are they turning in their forms on time? If we give them a formative exam, do they turn up and do it? Are they coming to tutorials? Are they actually logging in and looking at the course program? Things like that. Fairly straightforward stuff. When we initially started looking at this, though, we found there was also a wealth of data which was either theoretically or practically available, which immediately generated much more serious potential concerns, including things like where they are. And surprisingly enough, and this relates to some of the talks earlier today, this information is not necessarily kept in a very secure way, and it's not necessarily treated as being very sensitive. So the IP addresses of where they are, which tells you where they are when they log in, when they contact you, and things like that, is often available. Obviously, potential for misuse. There's the more qualitative aspect of what they're saying on public or semi-public forums, and there are things like how they actually engage with their assessment. Are they struggling? Are they doing things that might identify collusion? And why they're not turning up to things. And you can start to see, when you start to add all these measures together, you can get a uncomfortably detailed picture of what the student is doing and how. And so there's a real question here of what you can answer by knowing this data, and the point at which you should really stop, the point at which trying to figure out how to help the student by working out whether their attendance is okay, whether they're turning things in, becomes a really invasive profile. And I've sort of sketched out some examples of the ways in which a high level of data can start generating really difficult problems for teachers here. So, for example, it is theoretically possible to monitor web resources and how they're using the internet. It's done in many workplaces. What would you as a teacher do if you found out that one of your students was, for example, accessing essay buying websites? Is that something you need to act on? Is it something you should mention? Is it something you should ignore? If you find that information out, it creates very complex questions that you would have to answer. Much more obviously, more seriously, if your VLE collects IP addresses, which many of them do, if your student says they're ill and at home, but the IP address doesn't match their home, should you say something? Could it impact your opinion of the student? Would it perhaps be better if you don't know that information and are protected yourself from making these complex judgments that are effectively invasive? And on to other things. We have library access data whenever the student logs into the library. We know it. There is an issue that if the student says they're working hard, but your objective evidence shows that they haven't got into their VLE, they haven't taken anything out of the library, that may impact how you see the student. And even if you have the best of intentions, once you have that information, it's difficult to forget it, even if it's not formally actionable. It may have an impact on how you actually deal with the student. However, one of the problems with this is that this information, because it inevitably creates a conflict between the duty of care and the academic role, and the work we do with our students as junior colleagues to make sure the probity is correct and things like that, is that it's not always obvious when you pass that boundary to knowing too much and have a potentially invasive level of information. We often don't think in great detail about how the information is gained, and often this is available to us. So there are concerns that if you realize suddenly that you know that a student has been deceptive, you may have to decide on your own, within a matter of minutes, whether to act on it, to ignore it, and it's not entirely obvious at all what the ethically correct thing to do is and what the legal and professional thing to do is. And this is complicated even further in subjects like medicine, and that's where the professional frameworks are a separate layer of regulation, and you may be left in quite a thorny situation. All of this, of course, is set against the fact that we know that gaining data on students can help enhance their teaching and learning. From very simple things, such as was alluded to earlier, how many people start the course, how many people follow all the material, how many people finish and graduate. Are people coming to classes? If not, why not? Can we help them? But a critical problem is that the distinction between what we often call sensitive data and fairly common data is eroding quite rapidly. So an example of this in practice is that if we simply say, when do they log in, where do they log in, on what tool are they logging in, you could effectively track a student around the city of Edinburgh. One of our students, you could do it. The technical capacity is there. So it becomes invasive even though there's no sensitive data there. And so by accumulating this, it becomes very problematic. So we took the initial policy step that we would always aim to be very conservative. We would create barriers to protect ourselves and our students, make sure that whatever we gained, there was a very clear rationale, either derived empirically or from the literature, in order to actually use this, rather than taking the approach that whatever is out there, you should get your hands on as soon as possible. And this barrier is particularly important because it protects everyone. And we often talk about the conflicts and potential problems to the people you have the data on, such as the students, but again, it's also dangerous to the staff as well, because it puts them in very difficult situations. And often, you need to separate those roles out. So the way that we actually resolved this was by, first of all, making sure everybody had as much information as possible, clear communication to all parties, but secondly, by making sure that an academic who did not have an assessing role, who was not directly involved in pastoral or assessing students, was the custodian of the data, and to ensure that the barrier was there to basically protect the assessing academic from these complex issues and ensure that everything was dealt with carefully and appropriately. Now I'm going to pass over to Avril, our non-assessing academic, who can sort of describe how that post works.
Hello. Quickly a bit about me. I'm a research fellow with the Centre for Medical Education, so I was very much ready for this role. I was there and available, and I was also working on the project, so it seemed the logical thing for me to do. And what I do with this is very simple. On the one hand, I collect the information, I anonymise it, and I distribute it to who needs to know. Mostly Dave, who does the analysis, but he doesn't see any of the student data. I assign them all a random number, and I take any identifying information out. Slightly more complex, I deal with queries from staff and students. I do get requests for information that I don't necessarily think that other staff need, and so a lot of the time I am having to say, like, no, sorry, you can't have this information, you don't need it, but I can give you this. Students as well, they do sign an agreement to say that we can use this data, but a few of them from the cohort that we recruited this year were concerned about what the data was, what it was that actually identified them as being flagged for the early warning system. So why this role matters, I think in my role I came across a few things that shocked me, I suppose. But when I was requesting data, I was very rarely challenged on who I was and why I wanted the data. Now I always tried to make it clear who I was, why we wanted it, that we had ethical approval for it. But a few occasions when I was in a hurry, I didn't necessarily give them all the information, but I got it back. And I also got more than I asked for back as well, which I think can be a concern. As Dave was saying, if you're a staff member and you suddenly find out that a student hasn't logged into the VLE for 4 weeks, what do you do? They might not even have been looking for that information from the person they requested it, but they've been given the database and it's there. There's also the potential implication that if they're given that data, even if they don't look at it, if a student were to file a complaint and it was found that the staff member had that information, even though they hadn't used it, then the staff member could potentially be in trouble there. Some of the data can show students in an unfavourable light. As I say, people not logging into the VLEs at all, not handing in forms that are basically essential, particularly in medicine and vets, their ethics forms. They are required before they go out to practice to protect patients. And as Dave said, if staff have this information, they have not very long to decide what to do with it. And it does put them in a very difficult position. So as a non-assessing academic, I can channel this through the appropriate people and not have to worry about how that might affect the student or how it might affect me as a staff member. So I think this role, it is purely for this project, although we are doing it now in the medical school for other projects. I think it is very helpful to act as a barrier to protect students and staff. It can be used as a single point of contact for data collection and distribution to prevent staff getting more than they actually need, and only what they need and what they should actually be seeing. And as I said, you can liaise with the pastoral staff should you come across any issues and not involve any assessing academics loosely in the term. Pastoral staff will probably have a role in assessing, but not necessarily in the course or the year that you're looking at. So definitely gives you more options when you have this barrier between your staff students. Do we have any questions?
Thanks, David and Avril. Does look as though we've got quite a few questions. Can we start over there? Hamish, if you can. Right.
I can't resist making a comment, though. I'm sure Susan Graham, I was just wondering if Susan was going to leap in faster than me. Some of the information you say you don't collect, that's fine, but you didn't really comment on the fact as to whether or not it really is as readily available as you say it is, because I would say a fair amount of the information you discussed is actually personal information, and I don't believe that we would give it out to anybody doing a study just for the sake of it, and therefore there's going to be legal barriers in the way to getting that. Now, I know you said you weren't looking at that. That's fine. But I think for the sake of the audience, this information that you described is not just freely available to anybody who wants it.
No, and you're absolutely right. Some of this would bring you on to legal issues, which is another good reason to be conservative, make sure that you are looking for things that are appropriate. But IP addresses in particular are very technically available. And I think often there's a sort of two-stage process where the technical system is built, then the law is kind of applied over that. So I have been told on a technical level that things are available and then been asked to go and check that that's okay. So going back to Avril's point, I suspect that there are a lot of opportunities for data breaches and there are opportunities for things to be done that shouldn't be done. And so I would say that probably we could obtain things on a technical level that would be inappropriate to hold in a legal way. And then it becomes our job to make sure that we follow the appropriate guidance. I certainly agree that some of this material, particularly things like web traffic, probably wouldn't be easily accessible. But I do know that the VLE metrics that are generated show a huge amount about where the students come from, where they're going, how they're tracking about the site. And our student discussion boards have the had, that's now been removed, the option for anonymity, but it still recorded the identity. It was anonymous to other posters, but it was accessible to administrators. And so that sort of detail is capturable, even in circumstances where it might not be appropriate to do so. So it can become a very complex system, and I think that very clearly reflects the risks here, because you can get into a situation where somebody says, well, we could send you this, and it might actually be very inappropriate to do so, which is why it always has to be done very thoughtfully and carefully and conservatively.
I'll concede, I think, the VLE stuff. I would talk to you afterwards about the IP addresses, because I don't actually concede that you could easily collect IP addresses apart from machines that are within your own, utterly under your own control, which is not very many.
That would be based on the location from which they're attempting to log into the VLE. And remember, some of the courses we're talking about are quite heavily online based, and I was offered to be sent this. So it's something that somebody actually had said they could send me if I wanted it, which I said I didn't. But it is, unfortunately, possible. And the records number in the thousands, I'm afraid.
I'm curious, you said you got the students' consent. I was wondering how informed that is. Do you tell them all the metrics that you're going to collect at the outset?
We took quite a few steps to this. So the first step is that during induction and introduction, they complete some materials. They complete some materials on arrival. And what we do is we tell them how we will use their data, the ways in which their data is protected, how they can withdraw consent for either on a general basis.
That's what you'll do with the data. What about what data you're collecting? Do you tell them everything?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm sort of describing it step by step. So that's when they arrive. And then periodically, whenever we're doing something, we contact them again and we say, we're looking at X, we are going to collect measures Y and Z, and then we provide an opportunity for commentary discussion, and we give them somewhere to contact for further information, or to opt out, or to ask for.
Because I think following on from the last questioner, it's very apparent to a student working online what data can be seen. It's transparent. But the issue of the IP address, that's not so. I mean, I'm thinking of an on-campus equivalent. If a student says they're ill and then a staff sees them in a coffee shop, that they can see the staff member has seen them and they will follow up some kind of course. But if it's the unknown unknowns for the student that I think people would be concerned about. If they don't know you're collecting that, that's quite different from the informed consent model.
No, absolutely. We're always very, very clear to all the students we speak to exactly what we're talking about and why. And I don't think we would ever undertake work where they weren't informed. I mean, that's a pretty basic starting principle. So we would talk to them in advance about all these things. One thing that maybe should be mentioned on top of that is that we sort of routinely meet with our students to discuss kind of how their data is used and what we're trying to do to improve their assessment. So we actually spoke to each of the 5 cohorts of the 5 year groups and sort of told them what we were doing and why, what they thought about it as well. So we don't just rely on sort of negative opt-out processes. We also have quite a discursive way of developing this, and it was overwhelmingly positive. And if it had come out there was significance, we probably wouldn't have done it, because ultimately they're the owners of their information, and we shouldn't participate in that if they don't want us to.
Hello, Susan Graham, the university's data protection officer.
Hello.
The subject you're talking about is something that I've been thinking about a lot, not specifically your project, but learning analytics generally, because it's a big topic for the university just now. And in many ways, the issues that you're flagging and the kind of considerations that you've been taking into account are the important things that need to be thought about before these projects. And as you say, it's really important that people don't leap in. And I'm starting to think my theme for today might be just because you can doesn't mean you should. Within data protection legislation, there's probably 2 things that are particularly critical to this kind of work. The first one is the issue around legitimate purposes for getting the information. So things like IP addresses, it might be reasonable to collect those in a systems admin context, to provide audit trails, security, that kind of thing. But just because you've collected them for that does not mean you're allowed to use them for anything else. And in fact, data protection says you can't. You've collected them for one thing, and that's what you're supposed to use them for. The other thing is transparency, which is about making sure people are aware, and as previous speakers have identified, people are aware what's going to happen and exactly what's being collected. So again, with IP addresses, as data protection officer, I'd be very concerned if an area said, oh yeah, we routinely check everyone's IP addresses, see where they are. I'd be very concerned about that. If, on the other hand, an area said, we're doing a study, we've explained to the students what the study is, we've said it's optional, and within that study, we've told them exactly we're going to monitor IP addresses, it's optional, they don't have to participate, and in fact, they have to sign up to participate, that would be okay, because there they've got the information, they've got the control, and they can choose. So it isn't... Data protection doesn't always say no. Data protection often says you have to be very careful.
Well, thank you for that. And I can't remember if I spoke to yourself, but I did contact Student Records to discuss the data protection issue at some length. And I would tend to assume that something like an IP address is sufficiently personal that you would need a good reason. I assume it was one of those cases where it was captured by the system just to know to log in. And then inevitably, because learning analytics tends to excite so many people, people just say, well, this is here, why not look at this? And not thinking about the ethical dimension there, which of course is more evidence that you could get, say, 3 months into a project like that and then go, hang on, we've broken the law. And then you realize you've done something wrong. And so it's very important to talk discursively with lots of people. And we've always taken the view, I guess one of our guiding principles has been, is this something people would already look at in another context that's similar to this? And that's kind of been helpful for us to sort of summarize, because no one is checking IP addresses. People do check attendance. People do check whether someone's picked up a course handbook, and this is the electronic equivalent now. Have they logged into the VLE and checked the course page? And that sort of helped us. But we've always borne in mind that you can very easily get onto questions and data types that you shouldn't be looking at.
Hi, Sam Wilson. I'm one of the people who is part of what used to be called the network team, but isn't anymore. More of a comment than a question. Talking about IP addresses, and I'd like to be involved in any conversation you have with Brian later. Talking about IP addresses, we do, as a matter of course, record people's addresses and locations just because of the way that the system works. If you use the wireless network around the university, your location is recorded. IP addresses can appear in all sorts of different places. If you see an email address, if you look at an email message, you look in the header of that message, you'll find out often where it originated from. There's all sorts of places where this kind of stuff leaks out. And it's difficult to know quite how you put a bound on that.
Have one more final question down at the front, I think.
Hi. I was just interested to know if you, or to what extent you've thought about giving the students access to their own data. Sort of touching on the transparency thing that Susan was talking about. Do you find that you would get, or do you find that you do get better engagement from students if there's some sort of page they can go to where it says, here's your metrics for the past 6 months? Could they act as their own early warning system if they're given this info? And have you thought about that?
I think this is actually something we discussed a while ago, yeah. It's kind of a complex topic at the moment because we were really keen to sort of provide ranking data for assessments and things like that for sort of subsections of the exam. But we've been told by a few people that that can sometimes have a detrimental impact. So technically speaking, it's possible. I worry a little bit now that on a minority of students might have an adverse effect.
Yeah, it's not so much even ranking, it's more the data about them. I feel a lot more comfortable about data being collected about me if I can go and look at it. Not necessarily in the context of data about anybody else, but just so that I can see what has been collected and analyse it in my own ways if I want to.
Most of this stuff they will already know, kind of think about it. Some of it's fairly blunt. I mean, their mark on the formative exam, they know that. How many tutorials they've missed, they should be able to remember that.
Might be chastening to see it there in black and white, though.
But I mean, on a technical level, I know that some of the VLEs have particularly the ability to show your login patterns. I think with the idea being that it can help promote your learning.
Yeah, I actually think the VLEs tend to give sort of cohort data rather than individual data, which has definitely been shown to be detrimental, particularly where you're below the average. I'm not sure if that's accessible to students. I have access, but I don't know if that's widely available. But yeah, I think that would definitely have to be very widely discussed before you would implement that. But I mean, it's definitely possible. I collate all the data, and there would be no reason why I couldn't upload it. But yeah, I think that would be quite a big discussion before we.
I don't think anything falls into the class of sensitive data, though.
No.
I think it would just, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, just a row of, your attendance, your marks, when do you log in the most, how do you log in, things like that, which might be helpful.
Can we thank David and Avril again?